name is Barbara Coblin. I'm an Extension Master Gardener volunteer with the Dare County Center for the North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Extension is an outreach program provided by the North Carolina State University and North Carolina A&T University. Today I will be talking to you about the challenge of gardening on the Outer Banks. But first a word about the Master Gardeners. Dare County Extension Master Gardeners are a group of 100 plus members trained by a program supported by educational generated information provided by North Carolina State University. Volunteers become certified after 13 weeks of training and thereafter are required to complete training hours and education hours each year. The goal of Extension is education. We have the Speakers Bureau. We have Green Line, which is a telephone number you can call every Monday and Thursday between the hours of 10 and 12 from the months of March through November. They will answer your gardening questions, or if you prefer, you can email your questions to greenlineobx@gmail.com. We also support youth and community activities, and we support and maintain the Outer Banks Arboretum and Teaching Garden, which surrounds the Baum Center and is located in Kill Devil Hills. The purpose of this presentation is to acquaint you with the challenges of gardening on the Outer Banks. We will discuss the 4 different vegetation zones, the special conditions that exist on our coast, the zones and dates that are important for planting, and the key guidelines for success, or how you too can be a successful gardener. There are several unique and environmental factors that exist on the Outer Banks to make gardening quite a challenge and very interesting. Wind, salt, heat, sand, and drought all combine to make it difficult for the gardener who wants to improve his property by planting trees, ornamentals, shrubs, and flowers. That doesn't mean you have to settle for a yard full of sand. You can have a beautiful landscaped yard, but you're going to have to do a little planning and be aware of the environmental factors that affect gardening on the Outer Banks. There may be a limitation as to some of the plant species you can work with, but all in all, you will have a successful garden if you follow the guidelines and know about the dangers. The Outer Banks is a fragile ribbon of sand. It's a moving barrier island. All parts of the barrier island are not created equal when it comes to ecology. There is a wide variation of growing conditions between the narrow strip of sand from the oceanfront to the sound side. The character and habitat varies greatly along this narrow ribbon of sand, and it's very important to first understand where your property lies within the 4 vegetation zones. The 4 zones are oceanfront, dune, maritime forest, and marsh. This is a schematic to give you an idea of just how the vegetation differs. It's very sparse along the ocean, becomes more plentiful along the dunes. It's very plentiful in the maritime area, and then again, the kinds of foliage diminish as we get to the sound side. The oceanfront areas are the harshest and most difficult for the gardener. We have salty air, wind, and ocean overwash that make it very difficult for any plant to survive. Therefore, it's very important for the homeowner who lives on the oceanfront to know that the first line of defense is stabilizing the initial dunes. There are perennial grasses and some perennial plants that do very well in this hostile environment and look attractive as well. Oceanfront grasses are American beech, sea oats, and sea beech panicum. They stabilize the dune by sending deep, deep roots well into the dune to stabilize the sand underneath. Also, in the case of sea beech panicum particularly, this grass is able to reduce the velocity of the wind and trap sand particles within its above ground foliage. Blanket flower is a hardy, drought-tolerant perennial that grows where it wants to grow along the leeward side of the dunes. Prickly pear cactus is not a native plant, but it thinks it is. It has beautiful yellow flowers in the spring and edible fruits in the fall. As you move away from the ocean, you have the dune zone. The sandy flats have sparse vegetation. Working your way inland to the shrubby thicket areas, it will have an increase in vegetation until you reach the high dune area where there is a lot more. There's a greater choice of plant varieties the farther you move away from the ocean. And also, the chances of survival are greater because they aren't putting up with the harsh conditions that the ocean affords. Live oak, persimmon, wax myrtle, southern red oak, and Yopon holly are all kinds of plants that will grow very happily in the dune zone. That brings us to the third zone, the maritime forests. There are very few maritime forests left in the country, but on the Outer Banks, we are happy to boast of 5. Corolla, Kitty Hawk, Nag's Head, Buxton, and Ocracoke all have areas of maritime forest. These areas have naturally dense vegetation. The soil is less sandy, and it's home to a variety of landscape choices. Also, those plants that grow in the dune zone will also grow in the maritime forest. The effects of the wind and the salt are not as great here. Therefore, whatever is inside of the outlining trees is greatly protected from the harsh elements. What grows here? American beech, American holly, sweetbag magnolia, swamp dogwood, and black locust. All these grow in the maritime forest and are native plants. The last vegetation zone is the marsh zone. This is the most important ecologically. The zone is unique and it has vital contributions to barrier island health. Without the marsh zone, we would not have the marine life in the Sound. Plant communities here protect the shoreline from erosion and act as a collection and filtering system. They provide food and shelter to waterfowl and fish. 2 grasses grow in this zone. The salt marsh cordgrass grows along the sides of marshes and in areas flooded by the tides. It is essential in preventing erosion to the shoreline, and it can live because it excretes salt through the edges of its leaves. More importantly is black needle rush. This grass grows in the wetland areas all along the Sound, and it's absolutely vital in that it is the nursery for marine life. Do not ever, ever, ever remove either one of these grasses because they are so important to the ecology. Now, at this point, I'm sure you have decided where your property is located within the 4 zones. The next consideration for gardening on the Outer Banks is to know what you are going to have to fight against in order to have a successful garden. The first nasty is salt spray. Even if your property is not located on the oceanfront, you are going to have to put up with salt spray sooner or later. Water droplets formed by breaking waves laden with salt are carried by the wind inland, and they land on plants. The water evaporates, leaving a salt crystal. This crystal immediately proceeds to burn the plant tissue. You can often see signs of salt damage when you look at a tree or a stand of shrubs and see it is totally brown on one side and green on the other. This is the effect of the salt spray. Plants that do best in this environment are plants that have thick, leathery, or waxy leaves. They stand up much better to the environment than do thin, delicate leaves. The wind can affect plant growth in many ways. It can carry salt to your plants. It can erode the soil around a plant, thereby exposing the roots, or it can shred plant tissue. A northeast wind is typical during the winter months, but in the spring, when the temperature is balmy, winds come off the ocean with cold air, and they can damage the tender, leaves and stems of plants emerging. Almost constant winds, especially at the oceanfront, can wreak havoc with your landscape plants. Sandy soil is a very difficult medium in which to grow anything because it contains very few nutrients. In addition to that, the sun shines down on the sand and heats it up considerably in the summer. That baking of the roots is damaging, and the frying of the leaves and stems above the ground can also be damaging. Another problem is that water drains through sand so quickly you never know if the roots have enough. We experience extended periods of heat on the Outer Banks. This can stunt the growth of any plants, and with accompanying drought can lead to eventual death. And lack of water is certainly self-explanatory, since all living things need water to survive. So what you are dealing with is a plant that is burned by the salt, shredded by the wind, living in soil that provides very few nutrients. It's being baked underground and fried above ground, and it suffers from a lack of water. What do you do to reduce the effects of all these conditions? For the salt spray, you want to plant salt-resistant plants, those plants with thick, leathery, or waxy leaves. You want to preserve natural stands of vegetation. Do not take anything down from your property unless you absolutely have to, because these plants and trees and shrubs will protect what's in front of them from the elements. Rinse off vegetation after a salty event if at all possible. This means small trees, shrubs, and plantings can be rinsed off within 48 hours of a salt event. For the wind, you want to preserve and create a vegetative wind barrier. That means keeping those trees and shrubs on your property, particularly on the northeast side that receives the most punishing effects of the weather. Your home, garden shed, or garage can also be a barrier, and you want to plant in the most protected areas. That's in front of the vegetative wind barrier or in front of a hardscape structure. For sandy soil, you want to apply mulch liberally, 2 to 4 inches of mulch on all landscape beds and piled around trees to within 18 inches of the trunk will do a wonderful thing for your garden. Mulch will keep the soil from drying out, will keep the heat from disturbing the roots and the stems. It will prevent erosion. It will provide nutrients to the soil when it decomposes, and it looks good. You want to add organic material to the soil. That means compost and more compost, some manure, some leaves, anything organic that can eventually decompose and add nutrients to this poor quality soil. And you want to have your soil tested. The North Carolina Department of Agriculture will test your soil free from April through November. From December to March, there's a $4 charge. You can pick up your soil test kit at the Extension office in Manteo. For heat, we want to use heat-tolerant plants. All plants grow within a range of cool temperatures and hot temperatures. And for us who experience great periods of heat during the summer, we want to use as many heat-resistant plants as possible. We want to preserve or plant cooling shade trees. The idea is not to have your plants growing in constant shade, but allowing the trees to excrete their oxygen, thereby cooling the air and giving those plants, no matter where they're planted, a break from the sun. Lack of water is another big thing that we have a problem with. Mother Nature does not cooperate with us very much in the summer and leaves us dry. So we want to use drought-tolerant plants. Now, I've mentioned salt-tolerant, wind-tolerant, drought-tolerant plants. Many times they're the same plant. Establish a watering system to give those plants the water they need. Important zones and maps for the Outer Banks. The U.S. Department of Agriculture divided the country up into zones according to the annual average minimum temperature. The area way up north has an average annual minimum temperature of minus 50 degrees. while the area down in the south has an average annual minimum winter temperature of 40 degrees. We're Zone 8A. That means we experience 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit as our minimum temperature during the winter. The other zone date you're going to have to remember is the plant heat zone. All plants live in temperatures between what is cold and what is hot. We're Zone 6. What that means is we have from 45 to 60 days each summer of temperatures exceeding 86 degrees. We have to know these two zones simply because when you order plants, it will give you this information. And if you want to order a perennial, you want it to live through the winter. The first frost date is mid-November. The last freezing date north of Oregon Inlet is mid-April, and south of Oregon Inlet is mid-March. You don't want to put out anything before these dates because it can be damaged, particularly if you're near the ocean. The key guidelines to success. How are you going to pull all this information together? How are you going to combat the salt spray, the wind, the sandy soil, the heat, and the drought? First of all, you want to assess your property. You want to know what zone you live in. You want to determine if you need a salt wind barrier to protect plants in front of it. You want to have your soil tested. Use native plants. Native plants have evolved to successfully live on the Outer Banks through the eons. 75% of your landscape garden should be native plants, simply because to enjoy a garden, you must say to a plant, if you cannot take care of yourself, you cannot stay. Native plants will stay. They prevent soil erosion. They filter the quality of the water and make it much better. The plants will need less fertilizer, less water. They have more resistance to diseases and insect infestations. So native plants are definitely the way to go. You want to use mulch generously, 2 to 4 inches. Remember not to pack it against tree trunks. You can use bark, wood chips, pine straw, shredded newspapers, flat newspapers, leaves, anything that's going to cover the soil and keep the moisture in. Try to keep the heat out to prevent soil erosion, to prevent weeds from forming, and in addition to all this, it looks good. You want to establish a watering system. We all dream of having an underground watering system, but many of us cannot. So we're going to have to settle for sprinklers, soaker hoses, and drip irrigation. You want to sprinkle your lawn, but you do not want to sprinkle your landscape gardens. Our humidity is so high in the summer that water on leaves just encourages the growth of fungal and mold diseases. So what do you do to your landscape plants? You want to use a soaker hose above the mulch. If you use it underneath the mulch, the sand will clog the holes. So if you go the soaker hose method, that will be placed on top of the mulch. If you go with drip irrigation, you can supply each plant with enough water to make it happy, and that can go under the mulch. The rule of thumb is 1 inch of water a week, and try not to give it any more. The idea of that is the water filters down through the sand for several feet. You want to drive the roots of these plants down, down, down in search of the water. This will stabilize the plant, stabilize the roots, and it won't be as vulnerable to wind as it would be if it had shallow roots. Also, you can put a rain barrel under your rain spouts or under your rain chain, and you will have free water. You want to plan for stormwater drainage. When it rains on the Outer Banks, it often rains like a deluge. Water flows off your roof and into the streets and into the Sound. You don't want that. Water is expensive. You want to keep the water that Mother Nature gives you on your property. Contaminants from an asbestos roof, oil and gas from your driveway, fertilizer from your lawns, and animal feces from the wildlife areas of your property all contaminate water. If it runs down the street, it eventually finds its way into the ocean or sound, and that's an environmental no-no. So how do you keep water on your property? Well, you use rain spouts ending in a rain barrel. You can use rain chains the same way. A lucky few have a cistern. Or if you have an area that is depressed on your property, you can direct water right into that depression. Plant some plants around it that don't mind wet feet and that can stand drought, and you have made yourself a rain garden. You have turned a negative into a positive. Rain garden plants will absorb all that rainwater and filter the water at the same time. To summarize, I've told you about the 4 vegetation zones: the oceanfront, the dune, the maritime forest, and the marsh. The special conditions that exist on our coast to vex a gardener are salt spray, wind, sandy soil, heat, and drought. We know that we live in Zone 8A, which means we have an annual average minimum temperature of 10 to 15 degrees. The first frost is mid-November. The last frost is mid-April north of Oregon Inlet and mid-March south of Oregon Inlet. And our heat zone is 6, which means we receive 45 to 60 days of temperatures exceeding 86 degrees each summer. The key guidelines for success is assessing your property, knowing if you need to plant a salt wind barrier, knowing what zone you live in, and having your soil tested. Plant native plants for at least 75% of your landscape garden. Establish a water system. You want to use soaker hoses or drip irrigation in conjunction with sprinklers for your lawn. You want to improve sandy soil with mulch and more mulch. And you want to provide for stormwater drainage by creating a rain garden, using rain barrels, somehow keeping the water that nature gives you on your property. If you do all these things, you will be a successful gardener on the Outer Banks.